Hello, I'm Surgeon General, and in this video I will be sharing what feels like an off-brand Flickr build. Warning up front, this is 100% a meme build in the state that I'm sharing it. While it's a little clunky, I will include some thoughts later on in the video about how it could be reworked to actually be viable. The weird playstyle of this build is enabled by an interaction between a rune crafting enchantment that was introduced in Settlers League, which triggers a socketed fire spell on hit, Bodyswap of Sacrifice, and summon Raging Spirit of Enormity. The result is a heat-seeking lawnmower. You buzz your way through maps, and at the instant you hit an enemy, you automatically lock onto them and telefrag them down. The best part is that once you start the chain, you can't stop it. This is the Path of Exile Thunderdome. 2 men enter, and only 1 man leaves. Let's get into the mechanics. The new rune crafting enchantment reads, trigger a socketed fire spell on hit with a 0.25 second cooldown, and can be applied to one-handed axes. Since it is a local modifier on a weapon, any skill with both the fire and the spell tags can be triggered when dealing weapon damage with the axe. In my previous video, I showed how Static Strike can be used to automate weapon damage with little investment into actual attack-based stats. The downside with Static Strike, though, is the need to scale skill effect duration in order to extend the static buff, and the need to hit an enemy to begin the buff effect. This is fine for generic use, but with a more specialized character, you can use a different skill for much better quality of life. In this video, we will instead use Rage Vortex of Berserking. Upon use, this skill creates a rage storm around your character which tracks your movement for the duration of the storm. While the storm is active, you deal weapon damage to all enemies in the radius of the storm, allowing us to set up a spellcasting loop, continuously triggering the fire spells socketed in the axe. The storm does not have a set duration, but instead consumes rage at an increasing pace to upkeep the storm. For quality of life, we would like to get exceptionally high rage generation so that we can maintain the storm's effects for as long as possible. To do so, we take advantage of rage from 2 sources. First, we use an experimented heist base, the Psychotic Axe, for crafting our weapon, whose implicit grants us 5 rage on hit. This effect is capped to only proc a maximum of twice per second, so we get 10 rage per second while in combat from this source. Additionally, we get passive rage generation from Vengeful Cry. It is possible to get 100% uptime on this regen. For an explanation, see my recent video on the topic. With some investment into Warcry buff effect, you can scale the rage generation from this source to over 30 per second. With this rage generation, I'm able to sustain Rage Vortex of Berserking for just over 1 minute in my hideout. You could extend this about another 15 seconds when in combat from the on-hit effect. As an aside, I was surprised to find that the rage consumption from Rage Vortex of Berserking increased linearly instead of exponentially. The wording on the skill gem, accelerating rate and more rage loss per second, suggests to me that the rage consumption should compound on itself over time. This is not the case. The chart on the screen shows what the rage loss per second would be for both the cases of linear and exponential rage loss. During my hideout testing with 30 rage generation per second, I stopped over-sustaining rage at around 45 seconds, corresponding perfectly with linearly increasing rage loss. I would have run out of rage much sooner had the scaling on rage loss been exponential as expected. It's possible that this is a bug that will be fixed in the future. So I've shown how you can use Rage Vortex to continuously deal weapon damage in an area around you with great quality of life. Now let's look at spell payloads that we'll be delivering to deal damage and enable the Flickr-like mechanics. Body Swap is a fire spell and can therefore be automated by our trigger axe. When we hit with our Rage Storm, it will trigger Body Swap, teleporting us to the enemy that it hits and dealing fire damage proportional to our character's maximum life. However, the transfigured version, Bodyswap of Sacrifice, states it will prioritize minions over enemies. When a minion is targeted, the minion will be destroyed in an explosion, dealing damage around it proportional to the minion's maximum life. The base damage of this explosion on a 2020 gem is a whopping 28% of the minion's life, scaling even more at higher gem levels. This is extremely powerful for achieving a large amount of base damage because minion life is much easier to scale into the tens of thousands compared to player life. In order to take advantage of this mechanic, we need to pair this skill with a minion that has high base life and has the fire tag so that it can be automated. Summon Raging Spirit of Enormity fits the bill perfectly. The gem has a massive built-in more multiplier for minion maximum health. The multiplier increases as gem level increases, and, like other minion skills, the base life of the minion also increases with gem level. Picking up some minion life on the skill tree and from timeless jewel nodes, then supporting both skills with Empower, juiced up from our trigger axe, we're able to get the spirit's life to over 77,000, and the minion explosion up to 33% of max life, leaving us to over 25,000 base damage. For reference, this is more base damage than Discharge, expending 20 charges. Oh, and we can trigger this automatically 4 times per second. So now we've got the shell of a build. We just have to optimize the trigger setup. Trigger optimization could be a 30-minute video by itself, so I'm only going to outline the basics here so that you understand why I make the decisions I do. The important thing to understand is that time in PoE is broken up into discrete steps called server ticks, each lasting 33 milliseconds. Actions in the game can only take place on this interval. Regardless of the cooldown time shown on the skill tooltip, the actual effective cooldown time will be rounded up to the nearest integer multiple of the next server time. For our 0.25 second cooldown from the trigger axe, the effective cooldown is rounded up to the next server tick of 0.264 seconds. We can increase our DPS by increasing our cooldown recovery rate enough to drop a server tick out of the cooldown and reach the next breakpoint. The threshold amount of CDR needed to hit different integer multiples of server ticks is shown in the table. With just a boot implicit, we're able to get to the 231 millisecond breakpoint for both of our skills. The second important consideration is that a single hit can only trigger one spell at a time. Since our damage payload requires the combination of 2 spells, if we want to maximize our effective trigger rate, we actually need to hit twice with our delivery skill during the 231 millisecond cooldown window for either spell. This way, against single targets, we will alternate between the 2 skills. First, we will trigger Summon Raging Spirit, putting it on cooldown. When half of its cooldown is expired, we will be hitting again, but since it is still on cooldown, it is not able to be triggered. The game will then attempt to trigger the next socketed spell instead, which in this case is Bodyswap of Sacrifice. By the time the Rage Storm hits again, Summon Raging Spirit has just come off cooldown, it is triggered, and the process repeats. As long as our Rage Storm continues hitting and we have the mana to sustain the spell triggers, the process will continue indefinitely. Aligning the timings is a matter of adjusting your attack speed so that Rage Vortex hits just below the required 8.64 attacks per second. For the attack speed on my character, I was able to get the correct hit rate by supporting Rage Vortex with a level 20 multi-strike and a level 16 20 quality faster attacks. The correct combination will change character to character depending on their stats. Finally, socket order is important for the setup. You want Summon Raging Spirit in the first socket and Bodyswap in the second socket so that they will be triggered in the correct order when you first encounter an enemy. I've implemented this setup into a character to demonstrate that it's at least viable for endgame. However, I didn't really do any optimization. I just took an existing Warcry spell-based chieftain that I had for a standard defensive package and so that I didn't have to level another character. I changed out my Timeless Jewel and swapped some block nodes for minion life nodes to get a bunch of flat damage, and then dropped in a fire damage Light of Meaning near the Scion starting location to get my % increase damage. Even with this scuffed setup, I'm getting about 4 million Pinnacle Boss DPS. The big thing missing from the setup I'm showing are more damage multipliers. My character was intended to scale more spell damage from Rage via Ravenous Passion and Righteous Fire. However, the minion explosion from Bodyswap of Sacrifice does not scale with modifiers to spell damage. The only more multipliers in the current setup are from Inspiration and Elemental Focus supports. If one were to build a dedicated character for this mechanic, you could leverage ascendancies that get more generic multipliers like Elementalist's Convergence or Saboteur's Bomb Specialist. Sabo's Light Clockwork node would also be an interesting way to increase the trigger rate of the spells, which is essentially a more damage multiplier. Elementalist's exposure would be another good scaling vector, and the golem buffs could be used to get defenses. They would be basically immortal with all the minion life scaling the build gets. I think it would be somewhat straightforward to scale this up to 12 to 20 million DPS with an optimized tree and enough currency. Some other considerations if you're interested in tinkering with this. Using Rage Vortex of Berserking is not at all mandatory. You could instead drop this into a classic Cyclone setup. I'm just not a fan of the skill. If you want to avoid rage mechanics in the bottom left of the skill tree, that's probably the way to go. Lancing Steel of Spraying is another popular delivery skill, but it will not, in my opinion, work well with these skills. From what I can tell, the Raging Spirit will originate from your body, not the point of contact on the enemy, and so you will either teleport to the enemy and not get the base damage from detonating a minion, or you will teleport to the minion but miss the enemy with the explosion. Interestingly, you're actually considered stationary while body swapping even though you're teleporting around. This could lead to really good synergies with buffs like Arctic Armor, which grants you less damage taken while stationary, the Soul of Tukahama Pantheon for physical damage reduction and life regen, or the Armor Mastery for armor scaling. Also remember that although we're using minion stats to get our base damage, we're not actually dealing damage with the minions, so Necromancer isn't an auto pick. I'd love to see what other ideas people come up with, so please share them down below. If you have other tech that you would like me to cover in the mathematically correct way, please feel free to suggest them in the comments as well. I hope that this video has given you some ideas of tech that you can work into your own builds. If you enjoyed the video or are interested in more content of this type or in-depth build guides with an emphasis on mechanics, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support.